So there I was, alone in the middle of the Baltic Sea with an autopilot that didn't work. And it was my first solo night sail ever. What would you have done? I considered turning around, but then I would have to do exactly what I was trying to avoid, to sail back through the strait filled with currents and dock alone in the dark. And that just wasn't very tempting. So I stayed at the wheel, hand steering, hours after hours into the night. I was so tired, feeling my chin fall to the chest every now and then. But can you imagine my relief when I saw the first rays of the sun? That short period where the rays doesn't really hold any warmth, but still brings the promise of a new beginning. I remember closing my eyes just to feel them on my skin. It felt like a tiny miracle. It's absurd because the sun rises every day, but I was filled with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. This is a Sisi storytelling session, and today I will tell you about some of my most memorable experiences. I'm not proud of all of them, but they did teach me a lot. Later, I will also tell you about my upcoming newsletter that I will encourage you to join, and the bonus that you will receive if you do. Confused how I ended up alone at sea? To understand this, we will need to travel back in time. I actually haven't been sailing for that long. I have been sailing for 5 years, and in a lot of ways I still think of myself as a beginner. And how I even ended up at sea comes down to a bunch of coincidences, most of them not very pleasant. Back then I lived in the northern part of Greenland, where I had moved for my first grown-up job as a teacher in the north. Greenland is beautiful in every way that matters. It's raw and strong nature that leaves your soul naked. But it can also be a lonely place. So after almost 3 years, I decided that it was time to move back to Denmark and Europe. So I was looking into a future with 1, no job, 2, nowhere to live, and 3, my boyfriend and I broke up. And that was just a whole bunch of bad stuff at once. And now you might think it can't get any worse, but it could, because then COVID came. So the thought of me curled up in my old teenage room, trying to find a non-existing job with a broken heart in Corona exile with my parents, that was just not very tempting. So what I did is that I ran. So I got myself a place on a boat far away. And in that short period during COVID, where Europe was open in the summer, I returned to Denmark and jumped on a plane flying to the Pacific with a mission to cure my broken heart. And French Polynesia is just as much a paradise as you can imagine. It's endless beaches and crystal clear waters and corals and sharks and dolphins jumping at the bow. And I just wanted to learn something. Not because I needed it for my career, no, just for the fun of it. What I learned was to sail and a bit about boats. And then I also just had a lot of fun.
We said forever, but time ran cold. Fighting the fire, but losing control. Your words still echo in my head.
So after 11 months, I returned to Denmark with a mission to buy a boat and sail solo around in the north. So that was what I did. I bought a tiny boat, and after a year I left on my first voyage. I didn't begin alone, so on my first journey around the Baltic Sea I had 2 young men sailing with me for the first 3 weeks, and then I went solo. Slowly sailing longer and longer distances, feeling more and more confident. And then suddenly it was time for my first solo crossing of the Baltic Sea. And now we are back at the beginning where I began this episode. Sisi, alone at sea, with a broken Autopilot. I left the harbor around 5 and sailed out through the strait and into open waters. And everything went fine. Just around until sunset. Then things began to go wrong for me. I just couldn't make the autopilot work. It kept shutting off and I had no idea why. And in the end I realized that I had to manage on my own. Of course I considered turning around, but in the end I decided to continue. So there I was, hand steering hours after hours. I was so tired, fighting to keep awake, feeling the tiredness in my bones. The turning point was when the sun finally rose. A tiny miracle that happens every day. And it filled my body with renewed energy, and energy that I shouldn't have after not sleeping for 28 hours. I made it into harbor, and there I sent a text for my family saying that I was okay, and then I went to bed. You could think of this as a story about something that went wrong, but I am choosing to think of it as something that didn't go as planned, but that I managed anyway. It shows you what you can do when you have to. I'm sure there's a number of things that I could have done differently, or tied the wheel or something to get a little bit more rest. The point is, I was a beginner and I didn't know. And I managed as good as I could. And now I can tell you that this wheel pilot, it became my nemesis. Always a problem with that one. It's not a very fair criticism, because basically I am asking it to do something that it wasn't constructed for. It turned out that this time around the problem came down to my poor abilities to trim my sails. Yeah, not very proud of that one. But as I sailed, I got better at that, and then that specific problem disappeared. So I continued sailing for another 3 months, and slowly winter came creeping up upon me. And by the time I made it back to the Swedish east coast, it was very cold. I had a weather window with wind from the north that I needed to make the most of. So I was sailing in the outer parts of the archipelago because it was the fastest. All the small harbors that I came to, they were closed. There were no electricity, no water, and no fuel. And I felt like I had gone from an adventure to an expedition, quite simply because I didn't meet anyone and I felt so isolated. This was just a feeling. It's not like there's suddenly no people in Sweden during the winter. They're just not out in the archipelago. The cold wasn't imagined, and I could feel how it affected my brain and my body. And every day I had to stay extremely focused just to stay safe. It never got dangerous, but I could feel the importance of me holding myself in a mental iron grip just to avoid accidents. So around halfway from Stockholm to Denmark, my nemesis struck again. I remember I was sailing from Utklippan, an uninhabited island in the outer parts of the archipelago, and across the bay. The wind was strong and the boat was roaring through the waters with an average speed of 6 knots. And still it was a 9-hour sail, arriving in the dark. Snow and hail cut through the air like luminous streaks, dividing my field of vision into vertical lanes, only to land on the only visible skin in my face and melt. And it's about now that the autopilot breaks. And this time I could feel that it was an entire different problem. It was a mechanical problem. And when I arrived in harbor, I dismantled the wheel, and when I got it open, I could see that the belt inside was broken. And this is not hard to fix, especially not if you can get a hold of the spare part. And apparently it's just no one's priority to get spare parts to sailors during the winter. So it kept being sent after me, always arriving when I have just left. So that's how I ended up sailing the rest of the 300 sea miles back to my home port without an autopilot. And then you might ask, was this really necessary? And no, I could have left my boat at any harbor on the mainland, returned to Denmark and come back for the boat at Easter when it's warm and sunny. This was a choice. Every day I met my own boundary, but also every day I managed and I grew as a sailor. I returned to my home port in Denmark just before Christmas, and by then I was tired and exhausted. I needed a break. So that's what I did. I took a break, and then I slowly began preparing my boat for sailing into the North Sea. And that I will tell you about in the next storytelling episode. All of these stories I have written down in my book, Too Much and Too Wild. And obviously I am tremendously proud of this book. And if you would like to read more stories, the book is available on Amazon. I would also like to encourage you to join my new newsletter. It's absolutely free, and you will be receiving an update from me around once a month. There's a link here where you can sign up. And if you join now, I will send you the first 3 chapters from my book in English for free. Anyway, guys, you know where to find me. And then let's hope that this weather will soon break so that we can actually go out with our boats on the water.